This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. You're all very welcome to this evening's, or to the third Young Professional Network event this evening. It's the first one I'm chairing, so if you hear my voice shake, that is why. My name is Tara. I am one of the researchers here at the Institute. I focus on development and also on the European Union. But more importantly, I am delighted to be joined by Sally Hayden, an award-winning journalist and photographer who focuses on migration, conflict and humanitarian crises. So we will talk today a bit about seeking refuge on the central Mediterranean, also known as the world's deadliest migration route. But before I introduce you properly, I'm just going to give the format of this evening. So Sally and I are going to talk about a bit for 20-25 minutes. I will ask her a few questions of my own. That will hopefully provide like a summary for the audience to understand a bit more about the nature of her work and what exactly is going on in the Mediterranean Sea. And we will discuss the movement of refugees and migrants there, how they're being treated on the way to Europe, and then also how institutions like the European Union, the United Nations have responded to the migration crisis. And then we will move on to the Q&A session where you will be able to ask some questions. Okay, now Sally, I will introduce you very quickly. So you are an award-winning journalist and photographer. You have worked for, just to give you an idea, CNN, Time, BBC, the Irish Times, The Guardian, The New York Times, Al Jazeera, many, many more. You have also reported extensively from all across Africa, the Middle East, Europe, I think also a bit in North America, other parts of Asia. And I suppose important for this chat, you wrote this book, My Fourth Time We Drowned, Seeking Refuge on the World's Deadliest Migration Route. This was published in 2022. It has been translated, I think, into 5, is it, different languages? 4 or 5? Something like that. And it has won a lot of awards, one of which is the An Post Irish Book of the Year Award. So we have that out of the way. I'm going to start off with a simpler question for you, Sally, which is, how did you get into journalism in the first place? And maybe why do you focus specifically on conflict, humanitarian crises, migration?
Okay, I mean, I can give you like a longer answer or a shorter answer.
Whichever you prefer, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was generally interested in journalism, but I just didn't know any journalists, if that makes sense. So, like now, I'm sure lots of people here, you like look back and you're like, oh, it makes sense that I've ended up doing this. You know, like I was watching the news a lot when I was young. When I was in 5th class in school, we set up I went to a school called Our Lady's Grove. We set up the Grove Gazette newsletter. And in transition year, I won like a award from the Irish Star. So like you had to write an essay, and the prize was like a week's work experience and a camera. So I went in there and did that. I mean, it wasn't really what I wanted to do in terms of journalism, even though I couldn't verbalize that. It was like, you know, write about Brian McFadden wearing a lot of green and, you know, come up with like slogans like green with envy to describe it. A lot of puns as well. So, but I did that and it kind of gave me some little insight. And then when I went to college, I studied law. Which I do think actually is relevant because it's like learning about how the world works. Like I was always really interested, you know, I was one of these kids who's like, but why? And I wanted to understand how the world works, and generally so I did law. And I started writing for the student newspaper around 2nd year. And I was like really shy as well, by the way. So I was like, you know, I don't know. Like, I was scared to approach them in 1st year. That's why I never wrote in 1st year. And then in 2nd year, I was like, please, will you let me go and do, you know, anything? And they sent me off to do music interviews, and basically I became the person who would always say yes. So it was like, you know, can you go and interview Rizzle Kicks today in this place? And I'd be like, yes, and just like skip class and go and do it, which obviously isn't always advisable, but because of that, they gave me lots of opportunities. And then I started applying both for law jobs and for journalism internships. And I remember like it was kind of a case of I hadn't fully realized that I could do the thing I wanted to do. So when I was going to, you know, corporate legal internship interviews, they'd be like, why do you want to be a corporate lawyer? And I'd be like, I don't know, but I really want to do it. And they'd be like, you obviously don't. You want to be a journalist. Like everything on your CV is related to journalism. But yeah, so I got none of those internships and ended up getting, I think I did one with BBC. I did a 1 month's work experience with BBC right after I graduated my degree. I also did a J1, which I'm sure people here have done, and went to California and lived, you know, 9 of us in a 2-bedroom apartment, like on air beds. But while I was there, I emailed the local newspaper and said, can I do work experience? And they said yes. So I ended up for the Santa Barbara Independent reporting on a murder trial, which was like very, you know, scary. Not because of, you know, I didn't feel personally scared, but just intimidated. And also I kept having to call people on the phone and they'd be like not understanding my accent. And the editor was really keen on, you know, you must learn to call people and not be afraid. And I'd call up and they'd be like, I don't understand you. Send me an email. So that was very embarrassing, but also I guess was kind of broke down some of those walls of fear. And anyway, this is the long version, by the way. I then I applied for the Simon Cumbers scheme, which is Irish Aid funded, actually. And, sorry?
As you say, that for giving the journalist the opportunity to write stories.
In Simon Cumbers?
Yeah, I know about that. Sorry, yeah.
Okay, yes, yeah, exactly. So it's basically, I think it's just reopened, by the way. So if anyone is a student, you can probably apply for it, and there's a professional version, and I applied for the student version. So it's basically funding for, at that time, 3 students to go to a developing country and report on a specific issue, generally one that Irish Aid is interested in. And you got mentoring from a different national media outlet. So I applied, I looked up, you know, I didn't know anything, but I was like, what are their topics they're interested in? And they said gender equality, and that was one. And then I looked up the different countries, the 9 Irish Aid partner countries they were called at that time. One was Malawi, and Malawi had just got its first female president. So I was like, well, that would be an interesting story. Like, how has having a female president changed, you know, women's lives, if at all? And so I said I'd interview, you know, 4 different women from different backgrounds and just spend time with them and ask them, has this made any difference at all? Or, you know, what do you think about it? And it was a very basic idea, but I won the print version, got mentoring from the Irish Times. And that meant that they gave me this chunk of money that they said, you know, this is to pay for you to go to Malawi for, I think I was meant to go for like a week and, you know, stay in a hotel. And I was like, screw that, like I'm going to go for as long as I possibly can and just live somewhere much, much cheaper and do everything really cheaply. So I went there, I found a spare room in someone's house that I could rent for much cheaper. I only got public transport around. I just spent a lot of time like thinking that I was a journalist, but also not being a journalist because I had no idea how to be a journalist. Trying to write one story, which is ridiculous. Now I know, like, as a journalist, you don't get 6 weeks. I end up saying just 6 weeks, but you don't get 6 weeks to write one story generally. And I did things like, you know, I'd go down to the local market and I'd just sit with the people who sell things there, and we'd play this game called Bow, which I can't remember exactly, but I think it's a bit like checkers. And, you know, they'd tell me all the gossip. And then I also had to post on social media part of the Simon Cumbers at the time was they were like, can you post things on social media to publicize basically your work in the scheme? So I didn't really use Twitter at the time, but I was like tweeting, you know, I'm in Malawi, I'm an international journalist, which I like wasn't publishing anything, but anyway, no one noticed. So I started getting contacted by people like a presidential candidate who was running for the next presidential election, like Malawi's top hip-hop artist. And they would be like, let's meet up, you know, I hear you're an international journalist and you've come to our country. So I ended up just saying yes again to everybody and meeting them all. I mean, safety-wise, I don't know if that's always a great idea, but at that time I was just very excitable. So yeah, and basically what transpired was that there was a big corruption scandal. So I had been kind of living this life telling everyone I'm an international journalist. And then there was a scandal where a lot of politicians were found with huge stacks of cash in their boots and like loads of other places. And it's called Cashgate. This was 2013. It kind of blew up, and then I had a situation where somebody told me that the budget director for the government was going to be shot, potentially going to be assassinated. And then he actually was. This actually isn't funny, by the way, but don't worry, he doesn't die. He actually was shot. And I was like terrified because I was suddenly like, I thought, you know, I'm here telling everyone I'm a journalist. Things have got really real, and I can't even get anything published because I don't know how to do that. And like I was like sending emails to like the New York Times editor being like, hello, I'm a journalist in Malawi, like I'm in the middle of this corruption scandal, can you publish my article? And obviously no one responds. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I ended up leaving Malawi eventually, came back to Ireland. I was working as a Christmas elf in Grafton Street at one point, and in the Odeon as a cocktail waitress, and also writing up my I think in the end it was 2 stories that I had reported in this 6 weeks for the Irish Times. And I applied for an internship with CNN, and basically I'll end this story, even though it's obviously much longer, but I think it's interesting because it's Young Professional Network. I applied for this CNN internship, and when the anchors there, Becky Anderson, called me and she was like, 80 people applied for this internship. You know, we're interviewing, I don't know, 23 people will be chosen or 4 people will be chosen. Why should I pick you? You know, you're going to have the next however many minutes to convince me. And I answered all of her questions about actual news very, very badly. And then when she actually said this straight up, like, why do you want this job? I started babbling about this corruption scandal and being in Malawi and realizing the really importance of like accurate information when you're in a time of, you know, political crisis, and how people there were saying, we don't know what to trust because, you know, there's a lot of corruption even within the media because nobody has funding for journalism. And I gave this very long answer, and she said, okay, like that's fair. I was like, I just want to learn how to be a journalist. Like I don't know what I'm doing. And she said, okay, that's a good answer. So they took me on in CNN. I went from there to the Financial Times, interning and fact-checking. And then from there, I got a job in Vice News for 2 years in London, where I was like a general I was basically covering all international news except for America, because we had people there. And that was a good experience in some ways and really terrible in others. Yeah, I'm sure people know what has happened to Vice since. But yeah, like they had a team of like very young, passionate people who were like really just caring about the world. And for me, you know, I feel like sometimes when you're growing up, it can be like if you're enthusiastic about something, you feel like you have to temper that. And I was suddenly in this place where it was like everybody really just like cared about what they were doing and was very obsessive about it. And that was very exciting. And so since 2016, I've been freelance. I'm on contract for the Irish Times since 2021, but I've been working pretty steadily for them. But I also work for other people. And then I wrote this book, and I'm working on another book right now, which I don't want to talk about.
Okay, fair enough. That was great, thank you. Basically, fake it till you make it, but also just be passionate and it'll work out kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say faking, because I was actually in Malawi on I was actually in Malawi on an assignment. But yeah, I think like be careful what title you give yourself if you, if you end up in a crisis. And I think what I really learned as well, it's like actually not like, you really need to start from the bottom. In some ways, you need to be brave and care about things and go after what you think is important. But in another way, like, there's nothing wrong with spending time getting your fundamentals in order, because, like, I always say to people who want to be journalists, like, don't be really pushing to be at the top very quickly, because if you make, like, a mistake or you don't know how to handle a situation, you know, that can be very scary and even, you know, affect your career forever. Like, you really want to, it's tricky to say, but I think I realized in Malawi, like, I realized the importance of actually being the person at the bottom, watching other people make those decisions and seeing how they manage stressful situations. And, you know, in CNN, my job was, like, largely burning CDs and, like, taking people to the green room and taking them to get their makeup and making coffee. But at the same stage, I was in meetings where I watched people make, like Christiane Amanpour's show I worked on, like I watched her and her team go, what's going to be our big story on air? What questions are we going to ask to, you know, the prime minister of this country, or, you know, the rebel leader of wherever? And seeing that is actually very valuable. Like, you have to respect the people who have experience as well. So yeah, you need a balance of be brave and go at your own, and also, like, learn from others.
Okay, cool. You mentioned your book, and obviously I do want to talk a bit about the book. For those that haven't read it, I want everyone to really understand, like, the true story of the refugee crisis, the migration crisis in the Mediterranean. Could you tell us why you wrote the book, or how you got about writing the book, and then also kind of a short summary of what you wrote in the book?
Yes. I mean, ideally people will read the book and they can get all of the answers to all of those questions from it. But in the meantime, sorry, Catherine's written books, so she knows. I think, what did I write? Why did I write the book? What's in the book? So basically, I had been reporting on, when I worked for Vice, like I said, I was covering everything, which, like, I don't recommend. Like, it was very stressful. And every day we'd be like, what's the big story? And a lot of it was desk work. So, like, you're sitting in a desk in London. You know, journalists always want to be out and about talking to people. They don't want to be sitting at a desk kind of looking at press releases and rewriting news wires and all of this. And I basically was desperate to just go out and do anything. So it wasn't that I wanted to report on migration specifically, but I was like, you know, like, I would have reported on anything. And we were in Vice in August 2015, and it was when a lot of people were trying to cross from Calais in France to the UK, and that was making a lot of headlines. And David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, came out and said, you know, there are swarms of migrants trying to get here. And, like, me and my editor were like, what does that mean? like, who are these people? Why are they trying to come? Like, what does that mean? I don't understand that phrase at all. So I was like, well, just send me. I'm going to find that out. If you send me to Calais, I'll figure out what's going on. And he said, okay, fine, you can go. And so Vice had given me, like, I think, like 1,000 business cards, which I hadn't really got that much chance to use. So I was like, I'm going to take, like, a big load of my business cards with me, and went out to Calais with a photographer as well. And we went around and just talked to everybody. We were like, you know, exactly, why are you here? Why do you want to go to the UK? Where did you come from? Like, what should we know? Some people didn't want to talk, and then I'd give them a business card and go, well, that's my details, you know, that's my name, you can look me up. A lot of them knew Vice, which was quite handy, so they'd be like, oh yeah, Vice, and talk to me. And generally, like, it was just, it was like, you were meeting people from all over the world who had loads and loads of different reasons for why they were trying to come to the UK. You know, some had family members, some spoke English, some had been promised potential jobs. Like, there were people who had many, many reasons, and they had fled countries all over Africa, the Middle East, Asia. So it wasn't this homogenous mass of people that it's kind of being portrayed as in the media and politically. And what happened was I gave loads of people my cards. I said, contact me if you get to the UK, we can maybe meet up. And there were a few people who did make it, and I'm sure more made it, but there were a few who made it and contacted me. And one of those, sorry, this is like a very long answer again, so I'll cut part of the story. But basically, from leads that I got from that time, I ended up doing various other migration-related investigations. So, like, one thing I try to say to people, rather than being like, you know, asking just the questions that I think are important, I say, what do you think is important? What don't you think is being covered? What do you think the media is missing? Like, what do you feel like, what's misunderstood? Like, let me know what we should be reporting. And the things that people tell you are often like not what you would anticipate. And so I ended up doing one big investigation out of that with someone who I met in Calais, who then became a journalist, because he had met so many, he's called Ziad Gandour, he met so many journalists on his way to the UK that he was like, oh, that seems like a good job. Like, I guess I'll also be one. And he's now very successful in BBC, by the way. So we ended up teaming up, doing an investigation about people, Syrians who had reached Europe, who were then trying to return to Syria. And that investigation like won some awards and stuff. The EU European Migration Media Award got first prize in that. But also it was used in legal challenges. So I was like asked to go to Berlin and testify in a case against the German government, like about the status that was given to Syrian refugees, specifically like young males. And it was my first experience of like, your reporting can be used in these many other ways, like not just how you would anticipate. And it was also, by the way, the first Irish Times article published in Arabic, because we were like, we want it to be published in Arabic as well so that Syrians can read it. And I think the only Irish Times article ever published in Arabic as well. I hope it's still on the website. So so after that I then went to Sudan, did another investigation into UNHCR corruption, the UN Refugee Agency, corruption in the resettlement scheme. That again came from meeting refugees who were in Khartoum and saying, what should we be reporting? And they were like, you think you're reporting this, but actually you should be reporting this. And I did this investigation. UNHCR found eventually one staff member guilty of soliciting bribes and abusing power. And the allegations were that staff were taking bribes of like tens of thousands of dollars from refugees in Khartoum or in Sudan to move them to Western countries. So, you have the refugee resettlement schemes are meant to be for the most vulnerable people. I mean, it's always debatable how you define that, but instead there are widespread allegations of corruption. It was proven in this case, so I can't say corruption. But sorry, very long answer. That investigation was why this book started. So this book starts with a Facebook message that I got in 2018. And it said, "Hi, Sister Sally, we need your help. We're under bad condition in Libya prison. If you have time, I'll tell you all the story." And it came from someone who was in a detention center in Libya. A war had just broken out. And so basically there were hundreds of people. They had tried to reach Europe across the Mediterranean Sea. They had been caught by the Libyan Coast Guard. It turned out as a direct result of EU policy. So what Europe has been doing since 2017 is carrying out surveillance to spot boats of people who are trying to cross into Europe and giving that information to the Libyan Coast Guard, or so-called Libyan Coast Guard, because it's kind of like a collection of militias. But they then intercept the boats. And so this is a circumnavigation of international law, basically, because a European vessel can't push people back to Libya, but a Libyan vessel can. And so these people had tried to cross to Europe. They were caught at sea. They were forced back, locked up indefinitely, no charge or trial. And they're just locked up in these detention centers. And they had, been abused in various different ways for months. And then a war had broken out around them. So the guards who were guarding them suddenly ran away. They didn't know why. They didn't know what they're meant to do. They had no food, no water. They were just abandoned. And so at that point, they contacted me and they started explaining all of this. And I was obviously, I was in London at the time. I was quite hungover. I was watching Netflix. I was this Facebook message came and I was is this real? I wasn't taking it too seriously, but I was okay, I guess I should respond. So I said, I'm a journalist. I can't help you probably, but yeah, you can give me more information. We can talk for a bit if you want to. And the man who was messaging me then said, told me all this story. What I realized, like I said, was that they were there as a direct result of European Union policy, but also they were in a life or death situation. And so I started contacting everyone I could think of. I contacted the UN, I contacted NGOs, and eventually I started posting on Twitter screenshots of their messages. So I was I was a freelance journalist. You can't necessarily get something published very fast. I think it was also a Sunday, which can be a tricky time to get things published. And so I emailed my editors, I'm pretty certain, and said, I think this is a story, but I also then started posting on Twitter saying, I've been receiving these messages, these people seem to be in danger. Obviously they had approved me to do this as well. And so that's where the book starts, with those messages. What transpired was that I thought that this was one group of people, that they just needed help, and once they were helped, this whole thing would be over, and it must be a mistake, and maybe the war had started so suddenly. What actually happened was that I ended up with my contact details passed around many different detention centers. My tweets were seen by many, many people working in this field. I ended up being contacted by loads of both, people who were detained in detention centers and their family members, but also many of the people who were working in NGOs and in diplomats as well, in various aspects of what it turned out was a big system of abuse, and a big cycle of abuse that people were trapped in, and an EU-sanctioned cycle of abuse. And that was what I then spent years documenting. And so, yeah, like I said, it's much better explained in the book than it is by me here. And I've been told it's quite readable, so it might sound dense, but it also is, hopefully, easier to understand it that way.
It is very readable, it is. Staying with the EU, I want to talk then a bit about Rwanda, and I'm sure you'll know what I'm talking about. You write in your book about how certain wealthy countries fund developing countries like Rwanda to take in refugees instead of them coming, to Europe, for example. And I think we all know that a familiar case at the moment is the UK planning to deport people to Rwanda. Do you have... I think you have contacts with people in the UK who may get deported, is that right?
Yeah, we're waiting to see what happens right now with the election, because I think Rishi Sunak is saying there won't be deportations before the election, and Labour are saying they'll drop the plan if they're elected. So I guess we're waiting to see. Yeah, there's one chapter in the book on Rwanda, and now it feels a bit prescient that I included that, because the initial version of the book was finished, I think, before the Rwanda deal, and this paperback that you have has an update where I talk about it. The book and my reporting was actually used in the legal challenge against the UK Home Office. And so my reporting was on the EU-funded evacuation scheme that brings people from Libya to Rwanda, but then on to other countries. So they kind of go through the asylum process in Rwanda and then move on. But the UK Home Office used that as kind of evidence. You can hear them all the time. They kind of mischaracterize it, but they use that as evidence that, Rwanda is a good country and, UNHCR already works with it, the EU already works with it, so they should send people there. And so my experience reporting there was, I've reported there 3 times, I think, and I tried to go there again, I don't know if you saw that, in March, and was not allowed to board the plane. So it seems like I'm banned, though nobody has told me that officially. But basically, when I went to board the plane this time, I kind of noticed like 4 people looking, like passing around my passport and shaking their heads, like the airline staff at the gate. And then they said the Rwandan authorities had emailed them and said I'm not allowed to board the plane to Kigali, the capital. So yeah, that's, again, there's a whole chapter in the book on that. Hopefully people read it. That talks about what I found when I was reporting there. And I didn't report like any major scandal. I reported on one thing that I think is the reason I'm banned, though I haven't been told, which was about an allegation of attempted sexual assault against a minor in this refugee transit camp. And I reported that only after, like, I had actually been told, because I was in communication with people in the camp even when I wasn't in the country. I was told about that by people in the camp, and they were trying to get just an investigation because the person accused of it was still in the camp. He was working with the police. He was there, every day. They basically released a list of demands. They were like, we want UNHCR to have a presence here. We want, it was various things to make them feel more safe when they were in this camp. And instead, the Rwandan police came out on Twitter, actually, and said that this boy was lying. And then I published a story basically summarizing everything that had happened and that there hadn't been an investigation and that he was still there. And then the Rwandan president's spokesperson came out also on Twitter, a lot happens on Twitter, and said that I write refugee porn and that I was using this case to further my career. And then the government-associated newspaper, the New Times, published an article saying that I peddle lies and repeating this refugee porn quote. And so I think that was why I am no longer allowed to get planes to Rwanda. But I haven't tried the land border yet, so there's still hope.
There's still hope. I'm conscious of time. I think, so I can have the audience ask you a few questions as well, because I'm sure they want to. I will ask you one more of my own, and then we can go to the audience. So the book focuses on Libya, but since then, I believe it is Tunisia that is the most popular point of departure for people who want to get to Europe. You have reported a lot from Tunisia, but also now from Lebanon.
Only once from Tunisia.
Oh, once from Tunisia, and then now from Lebanon, correct?
And I'm not really reporting in Lebanon, I'm just living there.
Okay, right. That's a mistake on my part. The EU has given €1 billion to both countries, Tunisia and Lebanon, to kind of stop migrants from entering Europe. Is that correct? Yeah. And
or like they've done deals, I don't know how much.
I think it's $1 billion, yeah. I suppose, what have you seen there, and do you think this is like an indication that the EU will basically stop at no cost to stop migrants from coming in, which I suppose is maybe a bit like a double standard, considering at the exact same time we have taken in millions of Ukrainian refugees?
There's a lot in that question, to be honest. I think what I would really encourage people to do is consider, and one thing that by the way, as a journalist, you write kind of short articles and you tend to follow formulas in a certain way, and you don't get a lot of time to sit back and go, wait a second, what about the framing of this discussion? What about the words that I'm using? Writing a book gave me the chance to do that, and I think there's a lot of the terminology, there's a lot of the way this is spoken out about that is just kind of it's kind of wrong. Even the term you're saying, migration crisis, actually, I think what we have is a global inequality crisis, and we have a lot of countries with their own crises. Whereas when you say migration crisis, it's kind of ignoring that, in Sudan, for example, now we have 10 million internally displaced by war. since April 2024. You know, that's not a migration crisis, that's a crisis of war and a humanitarian crisis for Sudanese people. So nearly 2 million now have left the borders, but again, like, you know, it's not Europe's crisis so much as it's their crisis, if that makes sense. Tunisia, I went there last year. It's now the most common, I think still, but maybe double check that. It overtook anyway Libya as the most common departure point. And there again, like I went out there, I was meeting people from all over Africa, even some from Asia, who had, again, fled loads of different things. And so, you know, again, we're using this word migrants, but it's not a homogenous group of people. You know, migrant is obviously a descriptor, refugee is a legal status, but these are just people, you know, like us. And I feel like I repeat this over and over again, like people with hopes and dreams, people with family members. And the way that it's spoken about is, again, like this is a homogenous group, but also it's dehumanizing in that it kind of allows abuses to happen or overlooks the fact that so many people are dying even because of this terminology, I think. You know, if you heard that a boat of tourists had drowned in the Mediterranean, you'd be like, oh, there must have been a rescue launched. But if you hear a boat of migrants, you're like, oh yeah, that's normal. And I wrote an article for the New York Times actually right after the trip to Tunisia, and the headline that I think I gave it, but they certainly gave it, was mass death becomes normalized. And they put it on their front page, and I was like, that is how Europe, that is really the story for me now, but also am I now normalizing it even more by saying it has become normalized? So yeah, I think that's, what was the end of your question about Ukrainians?
Is there a bit of a double standard there that, you know, we as Europeans or as the European Union fund...
Oh, funding countries.
Yeah, and then at the same time, when it comes to Ukrainian refugees, I mean, everyone has the right to claim asylum, so I'm not saying Ukrainians shouldn't, but I'm just saying that it's interesting how we fund some people to make sure they don't come in, and yet we happily accept other groups.
Yeah, I mean, I think that no matter how you feel about migration, which, yeah, I mean, is a very simplistic phrase in itself that's not really fair to reality, but the EU is spending huge sums of money, like incomprehensible sums of money in ways that are kind of short-term, trying to stop migration from certain countries or certain areas. But from my reporting, I would see that they're actually contributing to destabilization. They're propping up authoritarian regimes. They're propping up militias, warlords, dictatorships. Tunisia, you know, you have Kais Saied, who's accused of being increasingly authoritarian. He had actually unleashed hate speech against Black Africans right before the EU did this deal. You know, I met people there, they had jobs, long-term jobs, they had accommodation, they were evicted, they were, you know, fired from their jobs, and they felt like they had no choice to go to Europe because of the hate speech he had unleashed. And right after that, you have Ursula von der Leyen and Mark Rutte from Netherlands and Giorgia Meloni, like standing with him and going, Team Europe, you know, we're doing a billion euro deal with him. And in Lebanon, I mean, I'm sure people know the country is very dysfunctional. There's, you know, a lot of corruption. There's a terrible economic crisis. And people there feel like EU aid should be contingent on economic reforms. A lot of citizens would feel that, and instead it's now potentially being given unconditionally because they want to stop migration. And actually, again, in the long term, are you not contributing to the destabilization? And you're increasing the systems that oppress people. You know, securitization, it's the same. It's increasing the systems that oppress people. And actually, in the book, there's a part where I go out on a rescue ship, and I had in the Mediterranean, I had thought that we were going to, you know, just assumed that we're going to rescue people from other parts of Africa. And instead, the people who came on board were Libyans. And they said, we're fleeing these militias because the militias now are so powerful and so terrifying that we can't live in Libya anymore. And as my book shows, like, militias are again being empowered by EU anti-migration funding.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sally. And also thank you for reminding us to check our language, you know. And
by the way, like, I'm always questioning my own use of language. Like, for me also, it's a work in progress. Yeah. I feel like we all need to be self-reflective about these things. And it's not like I'll be like, you should use this word and not that word. But I do think that, I think we all need to be constantly kind of thinking, am I contributing to, to bad framing of this or dehumanization, or how is this, what role am I playing in this as well, particularly as journalists, because I think the media has done a lot to kind of perpetuate certain framings.
Yeah. Okay. We'll go to Q&A now. I see hands already. Just over there. Yeah.
I wish I had brushed my hair if I knew it was
you
being
look great.
filmed.
Hi. Is it on?
If you want to just stand up, just so
Hi. I have done quite a bit of work with kind of grassroots organisations in Calais mostly, but also on the Serbian border. And one thing I find there is that there's a real mistrust with people on the move, but also with grassroots organisations of the media. I was just wondering how you kind of navigate that and how you feel that the relationship between all three parties can kind of be improved that way.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I mean, to be honest, I also mistrust lots of media, so I understand. I do think that there are lots of journalists who are trying to do the absolute best they can, and I think sometimes, media budgets are being cut. People don't always have the expenses or the support to go out and do certain types of reporting. Also, editors look at what gets the most clicks, and a lot of the time they won't commission stories on these types of things because they're like, well, nobody will read it. And when I talk to audiences, I say, please, read these stories, because the editors will notice if more people are interested in the topic and they'll commission more. I think that some of the problem does come from people just sitting at desks and kind of regurgitating certain, it's easy to get a statement from anyone powerful, basically. I can easily get a statement from a politician from my desk and just rewrite it, and it's hard to go out and talk to people who are anxious about speaking. You have to spend a bit of time with them. They might want to be anonymous as well, which is understandable in a lot of cases. I haven't really had major problems with distrust, but I think I don't really force anyone to talk to me. So I'll be like, like I said, give someone your contact detail, give them your card. They can contact you after they do their research on you. I think, I don't know. It's a bit of a tricky one. And at the same stage, we need more and more voices of, particularly refugees, I'm saying the word migrants after I said don't say it, but people making journeys, people on the move. The more voices we have, the better. And at the same stage, the whole system is set up to keep people quiet. It's set up that people will be dealing with a lot of trauma. They'll know anything they say can be used against them. If you're going through an asylum system, you really learn to be quite quiet, because you don't know what you could say that could suddenly be the one thing that they'll be like, oh, Eritreans, for example, were telling me they've had forced military service, but they can be told, you can't get certain protections because you've been in the military, but they're like, but it was forced, I didn't have a choice in that, but that might make them not eligible for certain things. I guess being patient, and also, to be honest, my book couldn't have been written if I was only interviewing people after the fact. The only reason that I had all this information was that we were all in touch while the thing was going on. I think to speak to people after the fact, a lot of people want to forget that they've been through this. It's like, do you want to be defined by the worst thing that's ever happened to you, or do you want to then move on with your life? And I think letting people engage with that in the way that they want to can also be best. I have a friend, for example, who's Syrian, who said, I think he started a comedy podcast about being a refugee, but he was like, this is how I want to deal with this topic, and I want to do it on my terms, and I want to do it as a joke. And I was like, that's great. Why not do that? So also some of the problem with the media, I guess, is that people don't want to be seen as victims, and you're kind of they feel like they're put in that position by speaking to you. And I understand that, and at the same stage, knowing what has happened is really important. So that's not a perfect answer, but thanks for your work.
Any more questions? Oh, yeah, down there. I see there's a question down there. Sorry, if you could just say your name as well, and affiliation, just so.
Yeah, my name is Niamh, and I work with the National Youth Council of Ireland and also Glencree Peace and Reconciliation Centre, and I do some other work as well. But my question is, I wrote it down so that it would be succinct. It's essentially, so thank you, Sally, but do you know any voices within Europe that are publicly speaking out against racist immigration policies, so that we could highlight some of these, apart from your own voice and the work that you're doing? Just kind of, as you said, it's like the system is more built for silence than it is for voice, and I think that kind of it's hard in some of the work that I'm doing. I'm trying to kind of draw on those voices to highlight to other people, like, look, there is an alternative, especially around the EU Migration Pact and things like that, but I can't seem to like find them that easily, and I was just wondering, in your researcher, and kind of even like ideally it would be people within positions of power, because I recognize grassroots organizations like Frontline Defenders and things like that are doing that work. But in that kind of wider sphere of like, politics, then maybe like even with NGOs, I don't see it as much apart from kind of grassroots organizations. So just wondering, is it maybe behind closed doors only, or is there some people who are, recognize all of the things that you highlight in your book and things that I can see in my research, which is around like the blatant racism in policies, and also what you highlight all the time, which is like kind of the ongoing like waste of money towards propping up like colonial structures and not putting money into investing in decolonial work, and basically like managing systems of mobilization in a way that makes sense for people, because people have migrated for millions of years.
That's a good question. I feel like I'm going to be really terrible now and forget everybody. So maybe it's better if I like send you a list later. But in terms of specific voices, I mean, I feel like I hear them all the time, but that's because the work that I'm doing. I know a lot of people who are talking up on it. It just depends. Do you mean in a politics sense, or like a policy sense, or like journalists, or I always think like, I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. Sorry?
Yeah, we can go to another question and then maybe.
Yeah. I don't know, because also journalistically, I'm not really supposed to say like I agree with this person, I agree with that person. Like I always have to be a little bit careful in terms of objectivity. So if I say like you should elevate this person, and then I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah, maybe we can have a discussion after, because I'm just, like I said, I'm like a bit conscious of not like promoting a certain organization or a certain voice. But I mean, on a general level, I think that's, I mean, I talked earlier about the importance of like questioning language and framing all the time, but also like there's, like looking at which voices are being listened to has been like a big part of my work, and my kind of realization as well that things are so problematic. And like, one of the ironies of doing this type of work is that I've ended up a lot of times in Brussels, for example, in discussions, with politicians, and for example, like everybody will be white generally, or like everybody will be from specific viewpoints, and there's always this very horrible thing as well that's like, you're sitting in a very comfortable room effectively discussing can people live or die. And the last event, they asked me to speak in Brussels in November at the EU Parliament, the Ombudsman Conference. And one of the translators actually spoke up and said, there's no sense of urgency here. Like, I don't understand why. Like they said, I think it was two separate people. One said there's no sense of urgency, and one said he was finding it very upsetting to come to work because the debate just seems so removed from like the actual realities of people. And I mean, people of different backgrounds, like even I think just looking at like not just racially, but like the diversity of voices, the backgrounds of people, the experiences of people, there needs to be like a general widening of that discussion. And I'm always like really conscious, by the way, I'm saying this as like a privileged white European woman, like one of the things that I talk about in the book that I tried to do is like get op-eds published by people who were in detention. I work with like various groups that are kind of helping people write their experiences, and also like exiled journalists getting into media in the UK, because that's where I lived for much longer than here. So journalists who have been exiled from their own countries. But yeah, I think that it's really a problem, and yeah, we all need to be kind of questioning the voices. And by the way, if you're talking about what you see in Irish media, I think Irish media is so terrible at international coverage. Like, and I say that as an employee of Irish media. It's really, really bad. And like the Irish Times, I think, is the best. We do invest in it, but generally it's very poor, and I don't know why that isn't brought up and questioned a lot more. For example, RTE right now, as far as I know, has no Africa correspondent. They have no one like assigned just to cover Africa, and I think that's such a problem. It's a continent of like 1.4 billion people. Like, you know, we're having these debates over xenophobia, you know, why are people coming here, blah, blah, and you don't even have someone designated to cover like this huge continent, which is obviously so varied and so many countries and so many different things happening. And, you know, couldn't you have like one person that's covering that? They did have one correspondent, I think, but now she's left, and she was hired under a DFA-funded scheme, from what I know. So that wasn't, you know, that was like a limited, you know, a limited period of funding anyway. I don't think I answered that very well, but no. Sorry, I'm also quite tired.
Well, you can talk later as well. So, any other? Yes, I see one there. Yeah, Anna, if you just there, yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Oisin McSweeney, Chair of the Economic Society in UCC. From your time reporting on the effects of the problems in countries forcing the migration to occur, is there anything you think will fix the problems? Is there any stories coming up that you might be able to report on that will fix the problems in the countries causing migration, or that will that ever happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the biggest problem is like global inequality, and I don't say that just as financial. Like global inequality as to access to rights, access to movement, access to, you know, climate change, for example. Like the West is producing huge amounts of emissions, and Africa is producing, I think the latest is 3.5% or something. It was at 1.2% of global emissions, and yet like many African countries are suffering hugely from climate change, lack of opportunities. It's very hard, like simple things like talking to friends in Nigeria, for example, and they're like, we don't have social welfare, we don't have accessible, you know, if we fall on hard times and we need help, we can't get that from our state, or, you know, if you can, it's very, very limited. And we in Ireland kind of take those things for granted to a certain extent. And particularly like passport, you know, having a powerful passport is so valuable. You have a powerful passport, you can still live in, you know, your home country, but you at least have the freedom. If something goes bad, you can move out of it. Whereas like the loops that people have to go through right now to try and get into Europe, you know, Ugandan friends who have had, you know, I'm thinking of like musicians, for example, who have gigs confirmed in the UK, and they have, like, you know, they have contracts, everything is set up, everything is legal, and they apply for the visa, and the whole process is so expensive and humiliating. Whereas if you have a powerful passport, you know, I've heard someone when I lived in Sierra Leone be like, do you even need a visa to come here? It's like, we have the freedom to move around. And when I was reporting this book, actually, I moved to Uganda basically as an economic migrant because London was too expensive for me, and I was trying to be able to focus on this work, and I was freelance, and I could live in Uganda for less money, and I got offered work from the Irish Times. And like the irony is not lost on me. Like I can go there as an economic migrant, you know, quite freely, whereas like people, you know, suddenly if you're trying to come the other way, it's like so evil and wrong. And at the same stage, we're extracting basically like, you know, a lot of medical workers from a lot of these countries. We're doing, you know, we're enabling a brain drain in a certain sense. So I think that there's a lot of factors at play there, but yeah, more of an acknowledgement of the fact that we live in kind of a system of global inequality is, you know, really important for actually understanding why all of this is happening, and the value placed on certain lives above others, the you know, the rights given to certain people. Like we can see in Gaza now, for example, what is happening to people. And if you had been born in Gaza, you're just born there by the chance of your birth. You know, you could be born anywhere in the world. It's very, random. But yeah, it totally depends, like whether you'll be safe and your family will be safe. And if you were in Gaza and you had a foreign passport, you have the chance to leave quite early. And if you were in Sudan and the EU embassies evacuated their staff and actually destroyed a load of Sudanese passports that they were holding for visa applications. One of my friends, his passport was taken by the Swedish embassy and he didn't get it back. And so he's Sudanese and he's suddenly trapped in Sudan with no passport, even though a Sudanese passport won't give you much rights anyway. But yeah, it just shows again the value placed on some lives compared to others, and who has power and who has wealth. And yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think I saw a question somewhere here before. I saw a hand just, though I don't want to ignore anyone, but if not, then there was definitely someone down there as well.
Testing. So you mentioned before your work being used against the German government and to some extent being misused by the British government to paint Rwanda as being safer than it actually was. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions for how you think your work should be used at different levels? Like, I admit I'm not in the area at all. I'm just a random guy who occasionally goes door to door and trying to debunk racist propaganda and whatnot. Do you think your work is useful in that area? And are there other uses that you could think of that I can't?
Yeah, sorry, maybe I explained that badly. So it wasn't used by the British government. It was actually used in the legal challenge against them. So the lawyers who were saying that the deportations shouldn't happen were the ones who submitted. I basically had to sign like a witness statement that just outlined like what I had experienced, and they submit that as expert evidence or something like that. How should my work be used? I'm always like so anxious about this because I think you can never predict consequences, and to be honest, like the vast majority of time there are no consequences. And like when I started out, I'd be like, if people only knew about this, everything would change. And I realized quite quickly that you can't, that probably it won't change, but also you can't necessarily predict what might happen as a result of it. And I've had some of my work used or referenced by like kind of right-wing groups, like my investigation into corruption in the UNHCR resettlement scheme that was referenced by right-wing groups. I can't remember actually what they were using it for, but I remember being told that that they had kind of, I don't know, made some point out of it. And I just think as a journalist you have to report what you see, and I really, really believe in the value of accurate information. I think I've been in enough situations where if something can happen and just not get reported and nobody knows about, like, I think before I became a journalist, I thought things just get reported and that's the way it is. And actually now I'm like, no, if they don't get reported, they might as well not exist for like a lot of people, like the people who went through them even might be like, this happened and no one will believe them. Whereas your role as a journalist is to really just make sure that there's a documentation, make sure, sometimes that no one can say they don't know, but even if they can say they don't know, at least it's in an article or it's in, a news report or whatever somewhere. And so in terms of consequences, I gave up a long time ago thinking that it leads to great change, but I have with this book, it's been very interesting, the people who have reached out to me. It hasn't all been like policy people. I mean, I've heard from a lot of staff in the EU, people who are very uncomfortable with the way things are at the moment, people who are very grateful that it's being reported, but can't speak themselves because of their jobs, or that's what they say anyway. But at the same stage, I've also heard, for example, from medics or people who work with refugees in different countries who will say, I didn't know what it means when someone tells me like their eyes don't work well because they've been in Libya. Now I know like they could have been locked in a detention center with no sunlight for months, and maybe that's what they mean. And that's been kind of like a good consequence, I would say. Consequence is the wrong word, but like a good thing. Maybe it's bringing more awareness so that person doesn't actually have to explain what they've been through in all cases, but there can still be that understanding that this is real. And I think one thing is that a lot of people who've gone through these journeys, like I documented at the end of the book, they'll get to a country, like there's two people I sat with in Sweden in a restaurant, and they were like, we're so amazed by like how well people treat their dogs here, like the way that they treat their pets when humans are being so abused on the borders, and yet, you know, we see these really pampered dogs. And then when we started, you know, they started reminiscing is again probably the wrong word, but they started like remembering what it was like in detention, and one of them kind of started crying, and I was like, we don't have to talk about this, you know, we can talk about something else. And he was like, actually, I want to talk about it because I feel like nobody here even believes that this is real. They don't understand that this is happening. They don't live in a world where they can comprehend that this is the reality for many people. And it's good for me to finally be able to talk, because like to a Swedish person, I would never mention this. And there was another person who was in a hospital actually getting medical treatment, and he got asked, I think the nurse or a doctor said, you know, here's the instructions for what you should do. And he said, can you write it down? Because I have like a really bad memory because of, she said, like, why do you have a bad memory? And he started explaining he had been through a lot of trauma, what had happened to him in Libya. And one, I'm sure people know, like one impact of trauma is that your memory can be quite affected. And he said, he told her this, and she goes, oh my God, it's like a movie. And he was like, imagine that's the reaction if you actually tell people what's happening. So in terms of my work, I think, yeah, I just felt like no Europeans should be able to say they don't know about this. Like, this is happening in our name. This is our money that's paying for this. This is our policy. And this is what we're enabling when we enable the kind of, you know, xenophobic, racist rhetoric to perpetrate, or like the political kind of discourse, the way that, you know, the way that certain things are put forward or phrases, even the use of the term migration management, when we don't challenge, like, does that mean you're locking people up indefinitely in detention centers where potential crimes against humanity are taking place? Like think about that when you hear someone use that term migration management. So I hope that's a consequence of my work, but in terms of actual change, I don't. And the legal stuff is very weird. Like I was a bit like, when they asked me to go to Berlin and testify, I was like, I don't know that I'm supposed to do this as a journalist. It's a bit strange, like, when do you become involved and when don't you? And with the Rwanda, once they used my reporting in the Rwanda challenge, I stopped reporting on the deportation, you know, the UK scheme, because I was like, now I guess technically I'm kind of a player in this in a weird way, but when I was going to Rwanda, I was trying to do something else. It wasn't related to that, but then I did write a piece, because the Irish Times asked me to, about being banned from Rwanda, but I did say that it was used in the legal case. But yeah, as a journalist, you're not really meant to be a player. So once you become like once you become involved in some way, you either have to declare that or kind of step away, I think.
Yeah, I'll check the time there. I think we'll do one more question, and then we may actually have to wrap up because we're over time already. But is there any other question? Anyone else? Yeah, I see. Yeah, there. Yeah. No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Eddie, and thank you very much for this wonderful talk and for the great work that you've been doing. I would just like to ask, what do you think can be done to amplify more voices like yours? And then also, ultimately, like, what do you think might be the solution to this migration crisis? Like, what should be done for us to address this migration crisis? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, to be honest, like, I don't really want my voice to be amplified at all, because I'm feeling like it's kind of complicated. Like I reported because I thought that was important, and I wrote the book because I wanted there to be all of this evidence that I had gathered to exist. And then when the book came out, I realized, you know, the night that it came out, I was thinking at midnight. I couldn't sleep. I was terrified. I was like, it's going to be out in the world. Everybody will know this is true. And, you know, I just didn't know what was going to happen. And then like a month passed, and they send you kind of your initial sales figures. And this is not, by the way, about commercial, but like in terms of how many people are actually reading the book, it was so low that I was like, oh, okay, I think I personally know all of those people, and they're my family members. So at that point, I kind of realized, well, like, how can I make people actually read the book? And I was getting asked to do events. So I was like, okay, I should probably do the events to, actually get people to read the book, basically. But like, I never had the aim of me being a speaker. I'm like, you should have seen me now. I'm a bit better, but like at the very beginning, like my voice would be shaking so much. I'd be not making any sense whatsoever. And like, I was really, really nervous and just, I don't have that much interest in being like a public person. Like, I mean, you can see when someone takes my photo, I'm like, so yeah, I find that whole aspect terrifying. And at the same stage, it's helpful to have people saying these things, I think. And for me, like, I know that a lot of the people who gave me information, they don't want to be the ones speaking for many different reasons. Like, they feel like, they're moving on with their lives now. They don't want it to be constantly that they have to talk about this very traumatic time. Some of it is security issues as well. Sometimes they don't want their family members to know what they've been through. So they'll have been lying to their family members all the way along and saying, everything is great, not to worry, I've eaten like a really massive plate of whatever it is. And, I'm very happy, when the reality is very different. And yeah, so for those reasons, obviously it can be helpful if I'm the one talking about it. But I do question how much good it is for me to be speaking. And yeah, I think the more voices, the better, basically, on this. The more people talking. There is one guy who, Yambio David, he's called, and he came through Libya, and he's set up a Twitter account called Refugees in Libya, and he's also trying to find more voices too, but he's been going around talking a lot about what's going on, and he's also collecting a lot of information, and that's good. And even to him, I was talking to him, and he was like, we were both saying, like, it shouldn't be just you, it needs to be more people, like, the more the better. So yeah, what can be done to help them? I think, I mean, I don't know who here has powerful positions, but like inviting people to speak, looking for people, elevating voices, getting people published, giving people encouragement about what they have to say, not just making it like, if there's someone who's been through this type of journey, not making it that they just have to talk about their experience, but like what they think the policies should be, what they think the answers are, or what they think would help. And in terms of your second question, and we did that, by the way. We did a story like, I forgot to answer that part of your question about Rwanda and people who might be deported to Rwanda. In the Irish Times, I got them recently to publish an op-ed by somebody in the UK, an Eritrean guy who is at risk of being sent to Rwanda. And I thought that was really important because he gets to say exactly what he wants to say without it all being filtered through me. We put that in the opinion pages, but it had to go under a fake name, and they thankfully agreed to do that. And yeah, how do we solve the migration crisis? Yeah, I don't know. I think there's many different, like, Europe is obviously becoming more, it's quite scary at the moment. And I think one of the things that I've noticed, like even before the last election, I was still reporting on this same topic. It's in the book, actually, when the EU declared the migration crisis over ahead of the European elections in 2019. I think that European officials are using a lot. They're saying we don't want the far right to get in power, and therefore we're increasingly imposing much more abusive policies because that's what the European public want, and because we don't want the far right to get in power. And I have to question, like, at what point do the centre-right become the far right in terms of particularly the migration policy? I think, again, that framing of, like, oh, the centre won again is, like, problematic because, I mean, read the book and ask yourself, is this not far right, migration policy? And yeah, I guess for me, I'm a journalist, I believe in facts. I think the first thing, if you're making any policy, I can't solve it myself, and I'm also never suggest policy because I work as a journalist, you're not really meant to do that, but I do think, how can we create any policy without actually understanding what the situation is right now? And if we're living in a state where, the current situation is being denied or covered up, or voices are being silenced, or we're not actually facing up to the consequences of what we've already done, then how can you make new policy? And until that's actually done, I think, anything that goes forward on the basis of the kind of flawed framing that we have now is going to be problematic.
Thank you so much, Sally. I think I definitely learned a lot. I hope you all did as well. I would suggest strongly that you read the book, not just as advertising for you, but because there's so much information in it that we weren't able to talk about today, and it really gives you good insight and kind of the truth of what is actually happening, because I feel like it's very easy to be fed lies. So I'm going to say thank you so much, Sally, to you for coming.
Yeah, no, thanks for your first
you said that. Well, I was just thinking when you were talking there that I mean, this institute is a great example of someone who can host people and amplify voices. So we will definitely try and do that in the future. So I think let's just give a big round of applause.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.